Hey guys, Matt, IronTrap Garage, and today we're going to do our Hot Rodding 101 series. We're going to do an entry today on the differences between a 39 Mercury and a 39 Ford. We just so happen to have two two-door or coupes, even though the Mercury didn't call it a coupe. But we have two very similar cars here that are both 1939 Mercury and a Ford, and although they look similar when you might see two of them, you know, in a distance, when you get them together, there is a lot of subtle differences, but there is also some parts that interchange, and it's been a huge learning curve for myself having a Mercury over the past handful of years of learning all these little things you would never think of that are different on a Mercury, even though they look very similar. So let's get started and show you some of the differences. All right, so like we do in a lot of these videos, we do differences with the cars. We're going to do a little bit of walking and talking because I think it's the most helpful to show you guys what the differences are, and you can really see the differences with the two cars next to each other here. So we're going to start with exterior or sheet metal and wheels and things like that. So number one, the sheet metal between a Mercury, at least in the 3940 range, between a Mercury and a Ford, completely different. Nothing is the same, although a lot of things look very similar. They are completely different. Nothing will interchange. Everything on the Mercury is basically a little bit bigger, a little more stylized, if you will. So that's what you will find. And the same goes with a Lincoln versus a Mercury versus a Ford. So with the Mercury, you can see even to start out with just like the bumpers are very similar. So they have very similar bumpers, but the Mercury has two little grooves in it versus the Ford having just one. Bumpers are similar in size, but you will see that the Mercury got a little fancier of bumper guards. The overriders and everything on them is just a little fancier than what the Ford was. So everything flows and stylized a little more. The grills, you could see the difference straight away. There is a horizontal, at least on 39 Mercury, a horizontal grill, very similar because it has the stainless trim that go over the grill bars. So you can see they were using the same design concepts, but the Ford has the vertical grill bars with the trim over it, the very similar trim. They have this peaked piece of trim in the center. They both have the same way of opening the hood. So on a Ford and a Mercury, you have this, one of my favorite things on this era of cars, the actual hood emblem also opens the hood. So you can see on the Mercury, same design, just a little different. It's a little shorter there, but the same exact type design on that. I'm going to put that down so I don't break it. But yes, they both have very similar ways that they open the hood, but the trim is different. You can see all the Art Deco lines. The Ford has more lines in there than the Mercury, but it's all, you know, you could tell the same kind of teams were working on designing them. They were looking at the Fords when they were doing the Mercurys. So they have all of that. Now the one big thing when you get to the hood on a Mercury versus a Ford, and if you want to just quickly tell the difference, other than we'll get to the difference in the roof, is this bulge in the side of the hood. I really love this on Mercurys. They have that little blister on the side where the Ford does not. And I think it's kind of a neat style on those that just has that little, again, sculpted, almost custom from the factory. So none of the trim interchanges. I mean, basically just think of it this way. Nothing on the exterior of the car between a Ford and a Mercury other than the headlights will interchange. So 39 and 40, 39 Mercury and 39 Ford and 40 Ford, 40 Mercury. Basically the headlights will interchange. So this is like my favorite style for the fat fender type cars. That Ford had the integrated, more streamlined headlight lenses and the trim rings on it, versus when they got into 40 and they did the sealed beam and they had the actual removable headlight with the sealed beam. I think this is a lot smoother than the 40s, but you could see same exact thing. Maybe I think part number wise they were exactly the same, even for restoration stuff. They had these have like a Ford script on them and part number and all of that. So they share that, and surprisingly enough, those fit exactly the same. So that works out really nicely. So we covered the bumpers and all that stuff. Fenders, they're very similar in shape. If you look at the front fenders, you could see the shape here has this kind of squared off section here in the back on the Ford. Much the same on the Mercury, but you could see how much longer it is. So they they stretched everything out on the Mercury to make it, a bit longer for just making the car more graceful and long. So that's what you see with the fenders, totally different, can't interchange. Even when you get into 39 and 40 Mercury, the fenders are a little bit different with the wheel openings and things like that. They both have cowl vents. That might be one other thing I've never tried to interchange, but the cowl vents, they both have cowl vents. I don't know if they interchange. They feel about the same.
Our expert measuring?
Our expert measuring. So the cowl vent appears to be, by doing my expert measuring with my arm, because I didn't feel like going to find a tape measure, but they both have the cowl vents in here, which is great for the early Fords because it helps a lot when you're driving in the summertime when it's hot out to get the windows open. The cowl vent kind of gets the air blowing through. So they both have the cowl vents on them that you obviously move from inside the vehicle. Now one big change or difference, and you'll notice that with the Mercury and Lincolns, they were always kind of like a year ahead with a lot of their stuff they were doing. So on the Mercurys, you will notice that the windshield wipers are actually down on the cowl here down below, and the Ford is up top here like they were for many years. Now Ford and 40, that's a quick way to tell the difference between a 40 Ford and a 39 Ford body if you're just looking at one at a junkyard or in a barn or something. That's a quick way you could tell. So Ford, in 40, they went down to having the wipers on the cowl here versus up on the roof. But on Mercury, they did that right away. So it was kind of a look into the future with that stuff. Mercury and Ford, it was like an option. I'm sorry, Ford, it was an option. You will notice the Mercury has this antenna here, boop, that swings up. Ford had an option to put that antenna here. Now this car in particular, even though it is a deluxe, it was not optioned for a radio. It has a block off inside the dash, which we'll show in a little bit, and it does not have a hole here for an antenna. But I've owned other cars. We did the Forgotten Hot Rod. That car had a hole punched in it that it must have originally had an antenna in it. But the Mercurys, I think it was pretty much just standard. They all got the radio in them. Pretty sure of that. I may be wrong, but everyone I've seen has that kind of Jetsons-looking antenna that pops off the top of the roof. You'll look at the windshield setup. A lot different on these. These have a little bit thicker of a frame. I actually, to be completely honest, I think the roof on a 3940 Ford Coupe is much better than a Mercury. I think if they would have put this roof on this car, would have nailed it. The Mercury would have been like damn near perfect. So you could see, we'll get some side shots, but you could see that the roof line is much different. But the windshields are completely different, even the shape of the trim and everything. This has a little bit thinner of a trim on it that wraps around. The inside is a little more fancier.
Does it crank out?
No, I don't think they do. No. That was a good. I never cranked mine out, so I'm like, wait, does it? Yeah.
No crank out.
Yeah, no crank out. Going into the doors and everything, you can see how much longer the door is. I don't think they called this a coupe. I think it was a two-door sedan. I forget what the name of the Mercury was exactly, but they called this a coupe. But the door is like a lot longer on the Mercury. You can really see it side by side, how much longer they are. The door handles are longer. Everything is just swept out. Similar shape, but this is just a little bit longer on there. On these cars. So the other interesting thing, when it starts really getting different, on the Mercurys, they tried to do kind of like a hardtop type look. So they have this stainless window frame that goes around here. And on the Fords, it's just what you would, what you would expect on a, 35 to 40 Ford has the same type of door. But on the Mercurys, they went totally different, and they actually made this stainless trim that goes around and the window goes up in it. So whenever it kind of gives it a little bit of that hard top look is what they were going for. And when people are customizing these, it is very favorable to have that. Gives a nice look. So and then you have the strip, thin little strip of a B-pillar in between here, where on the Fords they kind of integrated that B-pillar area into the quarter window. And the quarter window is much more rounded and I think flowy from the factory on the Ford versus the Mercury. So, all right, so going to the back end, you can see the difference between the trunk lid area. Again, myself, I think the trunk lid on a 3940 or even 37 to 40 is a little more graceful with how it flows down. On the Mercury, it kind of dips down really fast in the back there. But the styling is, you know, very similar where they're all kind of just have that flow back. The handles are kind of the same thing where they're on the back of it, but the actual handles and light is a lot less clunky on a Mercury versus the Ford one has that big round. Again, I think that was kind of like 37 to 39. It was kind of that way. The back taillight rear fender area is, you can really see the differences here. Again, I think Ford got it a little better on the Ford with that beautiful teardrop taillight design that is, you know, iconic for the 39, specifically for the 39, also 38 Deluxe. But on the 39s, it is, everybody calls them 39 taillights. Awesome. You kind of go over here to the Mercury. I'm not quite sure what they were going for. I mean, it is cool that you get some side marker, you know, you get some light out of the side there when you're driving down the road, but they kind of stick out a little awkward, which I think is interesting because with the Mercurys and the Lincolns, they're trying to like streamline and make everything flowy, and then you got these taillights just kind of awkwardly sticking out the side. Now 40 Merc, they did change that. It was a 39 Mercury only thing. Very difficult. I found that out when I got mine. All these little lens pieces, there's all kinds of pieces in here. There's the main housing, there's a lens here, there's a piece of trim there, there's a second piece of trim there, there's a lens there, and then there's a retainer that goes on the inside. So if you're missing some of those pieces, it gets a little difficult to find. 39 Mercury specific, as with a lot of the trim and the fenders and all that stuff, makes it very difficult. You can see on these with the rear window, they both have the split rear window that is very, very similar in design. I don't know, I never measured actually the windows, but they're, I'm sure they're a little different.
They look close.
They're actually, I think I did read that they might interchange the trim, but don't remember. Other thing is, they added a little neat little piece of trim here, which is actually to hide, I believe, how they attach the roof. On these, they actually kind of hid it there by putting that piece of trim on, which is kind of a nice feature. I think in a stock form, this looks pretty cool around the base of the roof. But the roof on a 37 to 40 coupe, you know, you can't beat the flow of that from the factory. It just is so nice. And then the Mercury, they kind of just went straight down. So the Mercury definitely is losing it there. I heard rumors and reading stories and in books and different things like that, that they say that this car was originally only supposed to be a convertible Mercury. And then the folklore that I've heard is that Henry Ford basically said, no, we need to offer a hardtop version. And they went and just plopped a roof on it. I don't know if that's true or not, but it definitely looks like it was kind of an afterthought versus, you know, the 39 Ford Coupe. It just flows and it just, you know, from the factory, it just looks right. So again, I can't say that enough. I wish they would have put this on here and you would have, you know, it would be mwah. So in the back, again, we talked about the taillights, and you could see just with the fenders how they are a little more pointed and pinch in on this, whereas you have a much bigger area in the back here and the taillights, or the rear fenders the way they are. So big differences when you stand in the back and look at these cars from the rear three-quarter view. It looks like a totally different car. One thing that does interchange is the factory, if you're looking to put skirts on these, the factory like accessory Ford 40 Ford skirts, bubble skirts, they fit on the Mercury and the Ford no problem. Actually, I think they fit 37 to 40 Ford and Mercury, all the same. You can bolt them on. So these are actually like 40 Ford accessory skirts that I put right on my Mercury. They fit on no problem. Everything is great. So you can do that. That is one thing that does interchange, but it's kind of an accessory they made as a one-size-fits-all. So next we're going to talk about some of the chassis and running gear and some of that stuff, and we'll walk back up front. All right, so we'll talk a little bit about engine, chassis, driveline, all that kind of stuff, and the differences. Some of this is obviously hidden underneath the car, so we'll try and discuss this a little bit. But this is where things kind of get a little tricky. When you start looking at these cars underneath, everything looks the same, but a lot of it is different. So the number one thing, if you start talking about the engines, obviously these are flathead powered vehicles. The Mercury, they started offering a 239 option versus a 221. So the engine was bumped up a little bit in the cubic inch in power for the Mercury model versus the Ford. So that was your number one big thing. The transmission, though, especially on a 39, it's still got the standard Ford 39 trans floor shift transmission in it. It wasn't anything different. It wasn't until you got into the Lincolns where they started changing the whole entire transmission. So the transmissions and the engines are the same. It's just the size of the engine on a Mercury technically should be a little bigger. Now from there, the chassis and stuff, it starts getting a little tricky. So the wheelbase on a Ford to Mercury is about 4 inches. I think it's 116 versus, I don't remember the two of them exactly, but they're about 4 inches longer on the Mercury. They did a lot of weird stuff with the driveline and the chassis and stuff to make it kind of stretched out. So I know the front wishbone is a little bit longer on them. I think Mike and I were discussing before the video. I think there's a plate or something they put on the wishbone.
It might be 40 Merc, I can't remember.
But I know the wishbone is a little bit longer on them. The drive shaft and all that stuff is obviously a little different. There was a one-piece drive shaft, like ring and pinion, pinion and drive shaft setup. For whatever weird reason, they made it kind of like took a step back, like a Model A or a 32 would have, where it was one piece. And they changed a lot of that stuff. The rear radius rods, all that stuff is a little different. So all those suspension pieces are just a little bit different. Now the brakes themselves, the same. They didn't, until they got to Lincoln, start upgrading the brakes. So Ford and Mercury got the same exact early Ford style brakes. Obviously with this being a 39, this is the first year of juice brakes on Ford and Mercury, which is very nice. The wheels are the same between Mercury and Ford. They got the wide 5 pattern starting, starting in 36, but ending in 39. But they got the same wheels. They weren't wider or any different, really. You just typically saw maybe the Mercurys were dressed up with wheel trim and things like that a little more, as standard. Now on the chassis, again, the frame rails and the X-member and all that stuff are kind of basically the same looking, but there's a lot of differences with tabs and things being added because the body on a Mercury is also, not only is it longer, it's also wider. So they were adding tabs and things for the body mounts to accommodate the wider body all over. So you can't just take a 39 or 40 Ford chassis and put it right under a Mercury. So many things are going to be different. With the cross member placement and all that type of stuff, that it's not going to interchange. And you will probably find that out the hard way with some of the suspension parts. We've done it definitely, that you get a front wishbone, it's just a little bit longer, it looks the same, and you're very confused. It may be that it's like a 39 or 40 Mercury wishbone. The radiators, they're going to be a little bit different just because of the shape of the grill and the size and everything like that. They're a little bit different. The hoses, all that kind of stuff is all going to be specific. While if you're building something that's custom, you may be able to interchange some of the Ford parts on the Mercury. To be correct, they're going to be a little bit different. I think even the chatter rods are Mercury specific as well. There's the rods that basically go from the transmission bell housing back to the chassis. Those are a different length between Ford and Mercury. So when you get into restoring a Mercury, you're going to run into a lot of that stuff, is all those little things are different. And again, when doing a hot rod or a custom, it's not a big deal. You can cut and weld and modify, but it makes it a little bit difficult for some of that stuff. All right, so we'll start talking about interior a little bit between the 39 Ford and 39 Mercury. So we're in the 39 Mercury here, and it's the same kind of concept goes between the exterior and the interior. They're very similar in design. You can tell the same manufacturer made them, but there's a lot of differences. So we'll start with the wheel. The wheel is, on a 39 Mercury, is very much like what a 40 Ford wheel would be. So they were kind of like 1 year ahead with this. The design is almost the same as a 40 Ford steering wheel, except it doesn't have these little lines in here. That's one way you can tell a Mercury and a Ford wheel. Obviously, the center horn button is, says Mercury on it, but the wheel itself versus a 39 would either have a 3-spoke steering wheel on like a standard, or would have the deluxe with the iconic banjo steering wheel. So it's kind of odd to me that Mercury didn't use a banjo steering wheel in this car. because it was a higher end car, but for whatever reason, maybe because it was a year ahead, they used the 40 Ford style steering wheel in these. The interior on these cars is very much, on all of these cars of the era, is very much like earth tones. So you're going to see browns and tans and things like that. So the dash, I think on pretty much all the Mercurys were this brownish color. The gauge panel, gauge cluster panel, and the steering column area is very unusual looking on a Mercury, 39 Mercury versus a 39 Ford. 39 Ford is very much like you're used to seeing on Fords that came before that. We just have the two round gauges in that spot. Here they started to use the sweeping gauge, which is actually kind of cool when you're driving the car. I think it is neat in design, where you see the needle, and then like the speedometer needle actually goes all the way down. So as you go up in speed, we'll see the needle kind of pass through the glass here, which is pretty cool. And it has the sweeping gauges there that are very much in these areas, very much like you start to see on a 40 Ford. So it was kind of like a look into the next year's model. But it is not quite as smooth as I think the Fords were in 39. You have this gauge panel that kind of sticks out, looks a little bit like an afterthought. The steering column surround itself is very unusual. I'm not sure why or what the reasoning was, but instead of having just like a round tube that comes up, they made this cover that goes around. It's kind of like a clamshell, has the ignition switches up on the top here, and it is very difficult, like we had to deal with, to add a turn signal stalk to this later on, because the steering column tube is actually shrouded by this trim here. So we actually ended up having to put ours down below. A little bit harder to turn the turn signal on and off, but they weren't thinking of that in 1938 when they were designing or whatever, 39. So this area is totally different. When you move over in the dashboard area, it starts getting a lot more similar to the Ford, where you're going to see the dual ashtrays here, and you're going to start seeing a radio grille here, even though it is a little bit different. You will see that on the Fords as well. That's similar design. And then on the Deluxes and the Mercurys as standard, got the clock with the trim around it. But you'll notice the Mercury has, is just a little fancier with how the grab for the glove boxes and things like that. They made it a little fancier, so to speak, that in chrome. This particular car, we actually have chrome garnish molding in it. Wouldn't have come that way from the factory, but at some point that was added by me, but it was somebody that did that. I found this in a car. It was done back in the day. Headliner and the visors and all that stuff, very similar thing. I don't know for sure, and somebody may correct me, but I think that might have been an option on 39 Fords, but on Mercurys, I believe it was from standard. The seats obviously are a little bit different, similar design, but a little bit different on these as far as the width goes, because the Mercury is quite a bit wider, so you're going to see a difference in the width of the seat. So this would not fit as nicely in a 39 Ford if you're trying to use it. Floor pans and everything inside, very similar, but again, it is Mercury specific versus Ford because of the size of the body. That stuff's all different. Gear shift lever is going to be basically the same. And the gas pedal, now Mike and I were discussing, I think the clutch and brake pedal might actually be a little longer on the Mercurys versus the Fords, but that's when you're getting into individual part numbers. But I believe they are a little different if you're doing a restoration on them. In the rear of these cars, this is basically like we discussed, they didn't really call this a coupe, but this is basically their coupe. On these, they had these interesting window cranks here, and you can actually roll the window back down on these, versus like a Ford, the coupe, the window was fixed and was not. But on these, you can actually roll them down. Little difficult because it's just this little T-handle. I'm sure when it was new and everything moved nicely, it was a little easier. But my car, it's a little harder because they don't go down very often. So but that's much different. You have these fancy ashtrays and the armrests in the back on the Mercury. So it's just a little bit fancier with everything on the interior. But again, you're going to see that earth tone or wood grain and tans and browns throughout the interior, both on the Ford and the Mercurys. So that is mainly the big differences between the two of these. The Mercury also always had a back seat. So with the Fords, you could basically get, you know, a business coupe, and you could either get a back seat or no back seat in some of those eras when you get into Ford. Whereas Mercury, you know, you could always had a back seat in the car because it was a bigger car overall, so they had room to obviously put that in there. All right, we're in the 39 Ford Coupe now, and you will see very much the same. And we'll just start right off with the steering wheel. Not quite sure why Mercury didn't do it, but the beautiful banjo steering wheel that came in the 39 Deluxe Fords. This car obviously has that. It's amazing design. It just looks so great. Now, when you get into the steering column area, like we talked about over there, it is so different in here. It's very simple, just what you would expect from Ford in this area with the steering column tube coming up, a steering drop here with the little ignition switch, and there you go, that's it. But on Mercury, they kind of shrouded this whole area with that big clamshell and had the switch on top. So at the time, it was probably a lot fancier, a little different than what people were expecting from a Ford product, so that's why they did it. On the Fords, you can see they kind of integrated, instead of having just one big ashtray on either side, they actually integrated the throttle and choke knobs into there. Again, with all the earth tones and the tans and the cream and the browns, golds, you'll see that all throughout, that you will see in the dash. On these models, you will see on the Fords, they actually had a block off here on this car where it was an option to get the radio. I think the Mercury's, it was pretty much standard. So this has a little block off here. Otherwise, it would have a similar little dials, rollers that you would have for the radio if it had that as an option. But they always stamp the dash basically for, in 39 at least, they stamp the dash for the speaker grill. Going over to the glove box, very similar. The trim is almost identical here, and the clock is very similar, but you see the grab for the handle is just a little different on the Ford. I think the Mercury is a little smoother. It's flush mount with just you stick your fingers in there and pull in and out. Which is a little nicer. The seat, the seat car, I believe, had been reupholstered, but you could see almost the same color interior. The other one is original and quite tattered, but is again back to that that tans and browns that you will see. And you will notice in the back here, we have no back seat. We just have a package tray back here, so you can only have 2 passengers in the coupe of this car. So it feels, even though they're only 4 inches difference in wheelbase, this car feels much smaller inside than the Mercury, even though they're not like incredibly different in size. Unlike like if you look at a Lincoln, from a 39 Lincoln, it's much bigger, and you understand why. But these cars, very similar in size, 4 inches of wheelbase. You wouldn't think you'd make that big of a difference. But with these, they were able, by the change in the roof shape and everything like that, and the quarter panel, they were able to get that back seat in there, and it fits nicely. From a sporty standpoint, or for looks, I mean, this is a lot cooler, so to speak, I think. But it's really crazy to look at how much more cramped this feels like inside. It's a little narrower inside, so the front seat, the passenger and the driver are much closer together, whereas the Mercury have a lot more room. You feel a lot further apart. You can almost fit 3 people wide easily in a Mercury, versus a Ford, you're kind of shoulder to shoulder when you're riding together. But the trim on a Ford versus a Mercury, so like the garnish molding on a Mercury, we showed you those stainless window frames. That was kind of like part of the garnish molding built into the door, and then they just have a little piece of garnish across the top of the door where you would put your arm, much like a convertible would have. Whereas all the Fords, I will shut this door, you can see it has a full piece of window trim like you would expect on the hardtop vehicles, on the closed cars. But on Mercury, they made it more like a convertible or a cabriolet, where it has a stainless frame and just a little piece of trim across the top of the door. So all that stuff, again, doesn't interchange. The doors are longer. Everything's kind of different. And again, the garnish molding on this is just surrounds the window like you saw in a lot of Fords of this era. So a lot of stuff is it's just changed a little bit, but it makes a big difference when you sit in between these 2 cars and go from one to the other, how different they were. And some things are better, some things aren't. But definitely the Mercury is a roomier and kind of fancier feeling car when you're inside of it. All right, so that was a quick rundown for Hot Rodding 101. I want to remind everybody that when we do these videos, it's just kind of the big hitting items we're trying to do this to maybe help someone out if they are just learning about these cars. There is a ton of differences. I definitely want you guys in the comments, as we always do with the Hot Rodding 101, is to talk about some of the differences maybe I missed. There's stuff that I'm still learning that I wouldn't know. But if you can drop down in the comments, if you have something you notice a big difference between the two of these, feel free to nerd out in the comments. But we tried to cover the big differences. It's really a special experience to own two of these cars and have them side by side. And that's why we're trying to do these videos, because it's not often you get the two of these cars side by side, except back when these cars were running around on the street as daily drivers. Hopefully this video was helpful and was informative for you. It was really fun for me to look over these cars and look at the differences, which I've never really done before until today. So thank you guys for following. Appreciate it. Catch you later.